She stepped off the train with one battered carpetbag and a curing method her dead father had carried to his grave, and the whole dusty town of Hollow Elm had already decided she wasn't worth the dust she'd brought with her. The man waiting for her, when he finally came, had ordered her the same way a man orders a load of seed corn off a catalog, to butcher and cure his hogs, to salt the pork before the cold came, and the meat spoiled, and nothing more. He was one bad winter, from the bank's ledger, from Elias Dern, reading his name aloud in that lean, precise voice, and taking back the only ground his family had ever owned. And he thought a hired woman with a strong back was the cheapest thing left to gamble on. What Amos Tanner did not know, what nobody in that flat, failing grass country knew, was that the quiet woman in the thin gray-blue dress had forgotten more about curing meat and the true worth of a thing than he would learn in 3 lifetimes. And she would be the one to see what no one else had let themselves see, that for years somebody had been bleeding this farm dry, dollar by dollar, weight by stolen weight, and smiling while they did it. She didn't come west to be grateful. She came to build something out of the ruin of her own life, and she had landed, by accident or by God's strange arithmetic, on exactly the ground where it could be done. If you ever had to build something from nothing, had to walk into a place that didn't want you and make it need you anyway, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back. It was October of 1879 west of the Smoky Hill River, Kansas, where the grass had already gone the color of old straw and the wind came off the flat country with nothing to slow it down. The train sat hissing at the little plank platform that called itself a depot, and Marin Calloway stood beside it with her carpetbag at her feet and waited for a man she had never met. She had read his letter so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. It had been a short letter and a cold one. A widowed hog farmer, it said, in need of a woman who could work, who could butcher, salt and cure, and keep a house besides. It had not said warm. It had not said welcome. It had only said the work and the wage that was no wage at all, but a roof and a name. And at the bottom, in a cramped, careful hand that looked like it had been wrung out of him, it had said, "I will not lie to you that this is a soft place. Come, if you mean to work." She had meant to work. She had no place left that meant anything else. The platform emptied. The few souls who had come to meet the train collected their parcels and their kin and drifted off toward the low brown street. And as they went, they looked at her, sighed long, the way people look at a thing they have already made up their minds about. A woman alone, off the train, with a single bag and no man beside her. She knew exactly what that looked like in a town this size. She kept her chin level and her eyes steady and let them look. Across the street, in the doorway of the general store, a plump, sharp-faced woman in a starched calico dress and apron had stopped sweeping to watch, and beside her, a thin man in shirt sleeves, and Marin heard, carried on that ceaseless wind, the particular music of a town deciding something about a stranger. "That'll be the Tanner woman," the sharp-faced one said, not troubling to lower her voice much. "Sent away for, like a plow." The man murmured something Marin couldn't catch. "A hired woman," the woman said back, crisp as the apron she wore. "Not a wife. You mark me, he didn't want a wife. He wanted a back." Marin Calloway, around 28 or 30 years old, slim but strong in the spine, with chestnut-brown hair pinned plain beneath a faded blue bonnet and a calm oval face that gave nothing away, turned her steady, dark hazel eyes once across the street, found the woman's gaze, and held it just long enough that the sweeping started again, brisk and offended. Then she looked back at the empty road that ran west out of town, and she waited, because there was nothing else to be done, and waiting was a thing she had gotten very good at. He almost didn't come. She would learn that later, that Amos Tanner had stood in his own dooryard that morning, with his hat in his scarred hands, and very nearly let the train come and go without him, because the whole business shamed him to his bones, sending off east for a woman like a sack of meal, and because some stubborn, ungenerous part of him had half hoped she wouldn't be on it. But the hogs had to be cured, and one man and one old hand couldn't do the work of it, and the bank did not care a thing for a man's shame. So he came. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the dry complaint of an axle that wanted grease, the slow plod of a tired horse, and then it came up the brown street out of the late afternoon light, and the man holding the reins was tall and raw-boned and sat with the heavy patience of someone used to carrying things alone. He drew up at the platform and looked at her, and she looked at him. His face was sun-creased and weather-browned, his dark hair gone gray at the temples, a short unkempt beard on his jaw, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a pale washed-out gray that had plainly learned a long time ago not to hope for much. A worn brown canvas coat, mud-caked boots, big hands, scarred across the knuckles, holding the reins like he didn't trust them to hold themselves. He did not get down. "You'd be Calloway," he said. It was not a question, and it was not a greeting. It was a man confirming an inventory. "Marin Calloway?" she said. "Yes." He looked at the carpet-bag at her feet. Just the one. Something moved behind the gray eyes, not relief, not disappointment, just a sum being taken. And then he jerked his chin toward the wagon bed. "Get up, then. Light's going." That was all. No hand offered to help her up. No word of, "How do you do?" No, "I'm Amos Tanner," though she knew his name from the letter, and he must have known she knew it. She lifted the carpet-bag herself, swung it into the bed beside a coil of rope and a stack of empty barrels that smelled faintly, ghostily, of brine, and climbed up onto the board beside him without being asked twice. She arranged her thin skirt, folded her chapped, work-hardened hands in her lap, and faced forward. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and the wagon pulled out of Hollow Elm, west, into the long, low light and the endless grass. They did not speak for a long while. The town fell away behind them, a single mean street, a church with a leaning steeple, the store where the sharp-faced woman was no doubt already telling someone what she'd seen, and then there was only the road and the grass and the wind, and far off, a thin dark line of timber that marked the river. Marin watched the country the way she watched everything, carefully, taking its measure. It was poorer than she'd let herself imagine. The few homesteads they passed sat hunched and gray, fences sagging, and once or twice a face came to a window to watch the Tanner wagon go by, and she felt the weight of being looked at again. He'd told the truth about one thing at least. It was not a soft place. "I'll say my terms plain," he said at last, his eyes never leaving the horse's ears, "so there's no trouble later." "All right," she said. "There's a room off the kitchen. It's yours. The house is mine." He paused, and his jaw worked once. "It's a working arrangement. You understand my meaning?" "I understand it," she said, and she did, and she found She was not offended, only tired and a little relieved to have it said out loud and done with. "I came to work, Mr. Tanner. I didn't come for anything else." Something in the flat way she said it made him glance over at her, just for a second. The first time he'd really looked at her since the platform, and then he looked back at the road, and she thought she saw the smallest loosening in his shoulders, as though he had braced for an argument that hadn't come. "There's hogs to butcher and cure before hard cold," he went on, gruff. "Getting it all out at once now. More'n 40 head, and not enough hands. You salt the pork, you pack the barrels. You'll have help, old Jubal. He's been with the place since before my father died. You do that, and there's a roof over you and a name on you, and you needn't answer to anybody. That's the whole of it." "That's enough," she said. He didn't answer that, but he didn't disagree either, and they rode the rest of the way in a silence that was, if not easy, at least no longer sharp. The Tanner place came up out of the dusk like something the land was slowly taking back. A low frame house, badly in need of paint, its porch sagging at one corner, a barn with a gap in its roof, shingles like a missing tooth, a few outbuildings, a pole corral, and beyond it the hog lot, where she could hear them moving and grunting in the failing light, fewer of them than there should have been on a farm meant to live by them. She could tell that much already, just by the sound, just by the thinness of it. And there, set off a little from the house, squat and dark and shut, was the smokehouse. She knew it for what it was, the instant her eye fell on it, the way you know a face in a crowd. A small windowless building of weathered board, its door hanging a little crooked on its hinges, no thread of smoke rising from it, no warmth coming off it. Cold, stone cold and shut up and half failing, the way a thing goes when it's been worked without being understood. Her father's smokehouse back east had never once gone cold in her whole girlhood, not once winter or summer. There had always been smoke breathing slow from under its eaves like the building itself was alive, and seeing this one dead and dark put a strange ache under her ribs, half grief and half something sharper, something that woke up in her and looked. That, she thought, that's the heart of it, and it stopped beating. As the wagon rolled into the yard, a dog came off the porch, a black and tan farm dog, ribby, watchful, its ears up, and an old man straightened slowly from the corral fence where he'd been waiting. He was stooped and white-stubbled, in patched overalls, and when he lifted a hand in greeting, she saw 2 fingers were missing from it. "Jubal," Amos said, by way of telling her who he was. "This is the Calloway woman." The old man came forward as the wagon stopped, moving slow but sure, and he looked up at Marin on the wagon board with a pair of faded, kind eyes. And he did a thing nobody in Hollow Elm had done all that long day. He took off his battered hat. "Ma'am," Jubal Reed said, "you'll be wore out from the train. There's coffee on, such as it is." It was a small thing, it was nearly nothing. But after the platform, and the woman with the broom, and the long cold ride beside a man who talked to her like an entry in a ledger, the plain decency of it caught her somewhere she hadn't been guarding, and Marin had to look away a moment toward the dark smokehouse before she trusted her voice. "Thank you," she said. "I'd be glad of it." She climbed down, herself again, no hand offered, and she'd stopped expecting one, and as her thin shoes touched the packed dirt of the Tanner yard, the black and tan dog came and stood close against her skirts, not begging, not afraid, just close, leaning its ribby weight against her leg and looking up. "That's Soot," Jubal said, and there was the ghost of a smile in his stubble. "He don't take to most. Reckon he's a fair judge." Amos had already swung down and was unhitching the horse, his back to all of it, as though the moment a body's labor was no longer required of him, he ceased to have any use for it. "Bag's in the back," he said over his shoulder. "Room's off the kitchen. Jubal'll show you. We start with the hogs at first light. No sense waiting on weather." And that was the whole of her welcome to the place she had crossed half a country to reach. Marin stood a moment in the cold blue dark, the dog warm against her leg, the dead smokehouse squatting black against the last green band of sky, the failing hog lot grunting behind her, the sagging house before her with one lamp burning thin and yellow in a window, and the wind coming off all that empty grass with nothing in the world to stop it. She let herself feel, just for a moment, the full size of where she was. A bought woman in a town that had already named her. A working arrangement with a man who'd buried his heart with his first wife, and meant to keep it buried. A farm one winter from the bank, with a herd too thin and a cure house gone cold and a roof full of holes, and not a soul here who thought she was anything but a back to bend over their barrels. She felt it all, and then quietly, the way a coal that looks dead will show one red eye when you blow across it, something in Marin Calloway set itself, hard and level and certain, behind those steady, dark hazel eyes. She thought of her father's hands in the brine, and the smoke breathing under the eaves, and the things he'd taught her that were hers and nobody else's, locked safe in her like money, sewn into a hymn. She looked again at the cold smokehouse, and this time she did not ache. This time she measured it the way you measure a thing you have already decided to fix. They thought she was the least valuable thing on this place. Let them. She picked up her own carpet bag from the wagon bed, settled it against her hip, and walked toward the house with the dog at her heel and her chin level, and the thought that went through her was not a complaint and was not a prayer. It was a plain, flat, unbreakable certainty, and it warmed her more than any coffee could. She had not been sent here. She had not been dragged here. She had put herself here on this exact patch of cold Kansas ground of her own will and for her own reasons, and they none of them, not the banker, nor the town, nor the broken man unhitching his horse in the dark, had the first idea yet what they had let in the door. The contract, such as it was, got spoken the next morning over a table that hadn't been wiped down proper in a season. Amos Tanner stood with his hat in his big scarred hands, turning the brim around and around the way a man does when he'd rather be anywhere but where he is, and he laid it out for her plain. "You'll have the back room," he said. "It locks from the inside. I'll not trouble you there, and you'll not trouble me. You butcher, and you cure, and you salt the pork, and come spring I pay you what the work's worth, or as much of it as there is to pay. That's the whole of it." He said it the way a man reads off a feed bill, like he'd practiced the words so they wouldn't carry anything in them. Marin Calloway listened with her hands folded in her lap, and her dark hazel eyes steady on his face, the way she looked at people before she looked at anything else, and when he was done, she only nodded once. "That'll do," she said. Not grateful, not afraid, just a woman, agreeing to terms she'd already decided she could live inside of. He'd expected her to flinch at the back room, maybe, or to press for something softer, and when she didn't, something flickered behind those pale gray eyes that had learned not to hope, not warmth, Nothing so generous as that. Only the small unease of a man whose careful arithmetic had a number in it he couldn't yet name. He put his hat on and went out to the hogs without another word, and Marin sat a moment longer in the cold kitchen looking at the dead woman's things still on the shelf above the stove. There was a chipped blue sugar bowl and a sampler stitched in a careful hand and gone brown at the edges, and a Sunday bonnet hung on a peg by the door that no living woman in that house would ever wear again. The grief was in the walls of the place the way damp gets into a cellar, into everything, and Marin understood, without being told, that the man she'd married had shut the door on needing anyone the day the fever took the first wife, and that he meant to keep it shut. She did not move the sugar bowl. She did not take down the bonnet. She only noted where the grief lived, the way she'd note where the leaks were in a roof, so she'd know what to step around. Then she rose, and she tied on her own faded blue bonnet, and she went out to learn the worst of it for herself. The worst of it was worse than the dusty street had led on. The Tanner place sat low on the flat grass country, the house and the barn and the cold half-failing smokehouse all gone gray for want of paint, and the hog lots beyond them held fewer animals than the lots were built for. Marin counted them twice, and came up short of 50, where there was pen enough for 200, and a good third of those that were left stood with their ribs showing and their coats rough. The kind of thin that comes not from one hard week, but from a long, slow slide. Jubal Reed found her at the fence. The old hired hand stooped and white-stubbled, missing the 2 fingers off his right hand, in overalls patched at the knee with cloth that didn't match. The black and tan dog Soot was at his heel, ribby and watchful, and the dog came and sat by Marin's skirts as if he'd already decided something about her that the men hadn't. Was 400 head, time the first Mrs. Tanner was living, Jubal said, slow-spoken, looking out at the lots like a man looking at a photograph of somebody dead. We run hogs from here clear to the river bottoms, sold cured pork to half the county, and barrels of it east on the railroad. He worked his jaw. Then it just went, year by year, like water out of a cracked crock. Amos did raise the same hogs, do the same work, and come settling up, there'd be less in his hand than the year before, and Mr. Dern at the bank would have his face longer each time he come out. Marin said nothing, but she was listening the way she listened to everything, with her whole quiet attention, and a thread caught in her mind and held, a man does the same work and gets less for it year on year, and nobody can say where it goes. That was not how a farm failed. A farm failed from drought or sickness, or a fool at the head of it, and from what she could see standing at that fence, Amos Tanner was no fool and no drunkard. He was a hard worker, bleeding from somewhere he couldn't find the wound. She filed it away and said only, "Show me the smokehouse." It was the one building she'd come to make her own, and it broke her heart a little to step inside it. The smokehouse was cold, not winter cold, but the deeper, deader cold of a place that hadn't held a proper fire in too long. The chamber gone dank, the hanging hooks above her bare and rust-spotted, the brine barrels in the corner sour-smelling and not half-tended. Whoever had cured here last had done it the way a tired man does a chore he no longer believes in, by rote and without care. And Marin stood in the middle of that ruined good room and felt the old steady anger she'd carried west move once in her chest. Back home, before her family's business, and her family's people were lost. Before the options ran out and the train carried her to this, her father had kept a smokehouse that men drove 40 miles to buy out of, and he had built it on a thing he guarded the way other men guarded gold, a way of brine and smoke, of timing and salt, and the particular hardwood and the slow, patient cold that he had taught to no one living but her. She did not say any of that to Jubal. A craft like that you did not lay on a table for strangers. Her father had been plain about it on his deathbed, that the method was the only inheritance the failing of the world had left her, and she was to spend it careful. So she only ran a chapped, work-hardened hand along a rusted hook and said, mild as milk, it'll want cleaning out, and a fire laid low for a day to dry it, and good salt, not the sweepings I expect you've been buying. Real salt. Jubal looked at her a long moment, then something eased in his weathered face, the first kindness anyone in Hollow Elm had shown her since the train. "I'll get you your salt, Mrs. Tanner," he said, and meant it. By the third day she'd had the smokehouse swept and the barrels scalded out and a low fire laid to drive the damp, and by the end of the first week, when Amos brought in the first of the hogs for killing, she went to the work like a woman come home. The town did not see it that way. The town, what little of it bothered to look out toward the Tanner place, saw only a thin woman in a thin gray-blue dress doing a man's bloody labor that no proper wife would, and the town had a mouth, and the mouth belonged to Nettie Falk. Marin met it head-on the first time she walked into the store for the salt. The storekeeper's wife, sharp-faced and plump, in her starched calico and apron, breaking off whatever she'd been saying to a knot of women by the dry goods the moment Marin came through the door. "Well," Nettie said, loud enough to carry, sweet enough to cut, "if it isn't the Tanner woman, or what do we call her, ladies? Hard to know. A man sends off east for a wife the way you'd send off for a plow and gets her shipped in on the freight, and we're all meant to call it a marriage." A little laugh went around the dry goods. "Separate rooms, I'm told. A hired woman, not a wife. That poor man, taking on a stranger to do his butchering because no decent girl in 3 counties would have him after he buried the first one." Marin stood at the counter and let it wash over her, and when it had run itself out, she only laid her coin down and said, even and unhurried, "I'll take the salt, please." The course, not the table. 20 pounds to start. She did not defend herself, and she did not redden, and she did not give Nettie Falk so much as the satisfaction of a flinch. And that steadiness, more than any answer, was the thing that made the room go quiet behind her as she carried her salt out into the cold street. Let them talk. Talk did not cure a ham. Her father used to say a reputation was the slowest crop a person ever grew, and the only one worth the planting, and she had not come to Hollow Elm to be liked. She had come to work and to be straight, and the being straight came due sooner than she'd have chosen. It was a hard evening in the second week, the wind up off the flat country and rattling the loose shingles, when Amos found her in the smokehouse past dark, working brine into a side of pork by lantern light, with her sleeves shoved up over her chapped forearms. He'd come to tell her some short thing about the morning's killing, but he stopped in the doorway and watched her hands a moment, the sure unhurried way they moved, and she felt him watching and did not stop. "You've done this before," he said. It was almost an accusation, the way a closed man makes anything that surprises him sound like a thing held back from him on purpose. Marin set down the side of pork and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him square. "I have," she said, "more than I've let on, and I want to be straight with you about that. My father kept a smokehouse back east, a good one, and I worked it at his elbow from the time I could carry a bucket. There's a way he had of curing, of the brine and the smoke and the keeping, that he taught to me and to nobody else, and I mean to use it on your hogs. I'm telling you, so you'll not think me a liar later when your hams come out of this room better than any pork that's ever left this farm." She held his gray eyes while she said it. "I'll not tell you the whole of the method, and I'd ask you not to press me on it. It's the one thing I came west still owning, but it's yours to profit from, every bit, and that I'll swear to." For a long moment, Amos Tanner said nothing at all. The lantern hissed between them. He had ordered a woman to salt his pork, the way a man orders seed corn, and he had got instead something he had no slot for in his careful, narrowed life, a person with a thing of value of her own, offering it to him plain and asking only to keep her one secret. "All right," he said at last, gruff, looking at the brine barrel and not at her. "Cure them however you like. God knows the old way wasn't getting us anywhere." And then, because the honesty in her had cracked something loose, or because the dark and the lantern made it easier, he told her the rest of the worst of it, the part Jubal had been too loyal to lay out whole. He told her about Elias Dern's note, the full balance, every dollar, due by the first thaw of spring, and not a kind word of extension to be had from the lean, precise man in the black frock coat who came out twice a year with his spectacles and his ledger and his cold arithmetic. He told her the herd was a third what it should be, and he hadn't the cash to buy in more, and that he'd cut the hands down to just old Jubal, who stayed on for grub and loyalty more than wages. He told her, in fewer words and a flatter voice, that he was one bad winter from being a man with no farm and no name and nothing to show for 15 years of breaking his back on this grass but a fresh grave and a mortgage he couldn't carry. "So, you see what you married into," he finished, and for once there was something almost like an apology in it. "It wasn't a kindness sending for you. It was a drowning man grabbing the nearest thing. I'd not blame you for being sore about it." Marin took that in the way she took everything, steady and without drama, and when she answered, she did not soften it into comfort he wouldn't have trusted anyway. "I'm not sore," she said. "I knew the shape of it before the train ever stopped. A man with money doesn't send east for a stranger." She picked the side of pork back up. "We'll see about the spring." But behind the calm of it, her mind had already gone where it kept going, back to the thing that didn't sit right, to Jubal's water out of a cracked crock, to a hard-working man getting less in his hand each year for the same labor. That night, after Amos had gone into the cold house and his cold bed and his cold grief, Marin lit a fresh candle in the back room that locked from the inside, and she did not sleep. She got out the only ledger the farm kept, a thin, water-stained book of Amos's cramped figures, and she went down the columns the way her father had taught her, slow, with a head for trade and tallies that the town would never once have credited to a hired woman in a thin gray dress. And the deeper she went, the more her quiet calm hardened into something with an edge under it. Here was a barrel of cured pork sold to the buyer last fall, graded common and paid out at common's price. But Marin knew curing, knew it in her bones, and from Amos's own notes on the brine and the smoke, that pork had been no common grade. Somebody had stamped good work cheap and pocketed the difference. Here was a lot of hogs sold by weight, and the weight set down was light, lighter than that many animals of that size had any business weighing, even thin. Year on year the same buyer, the same smooth short numbers, the same long face on the banker who only ever saw what the buyer chose to leave behind. She did not yet have his measure whole. She had no proof a court or even a stubborn man would credit, and she was wise enough and knew enough to know that a hired woman crying thief at the most prosperous merchant in the county would be laughed clear back to the railroad. So she said nothing. She closed the thin water-stained book and pinched out the candle and lay a long while in the dark with the dog Soot breathing slow against the door he'd taken to guarding, and she let the suspicion settle into something cold and patient and certain. The farm was not dying of a bad winter or a fool's hand or God's indifference. The farm was being bled, careful and steady, by a hand that signed its name to the receipts, and the name on every one of those receipts, in a smooth, prosperous slant, was Harlan Voss. The first hams came out of the smokehouse on a gray morning in late November, and Marin Calloway did not say a word until she had cut into one. She had hung them 3 weeks back after a curing. She would not let Jubal Reed watch the whole of, not because she did not trust the old man, but because there were steps in it that were not hers to give away, steps her father had carried out of his own father's smokehouse in a county she would never see again. The brine had a measure of things in it she mixed in the dark of the spring house with the door shut. The smoke was slow, low, and steady. Hickory laid green over a banked coal bed so it smoldered rather than burned, and she had risen twice a night for 19 nights to tend it, walking out across the frozen yard with a lantern, and the dog Soot trotting Ribby at her heel, to feed the fire one split at a time and watch the thin blue thread of it climb. Amos Tanner had watched her do it from the kitchen window more than once, a tall, raw-boned shape, with his coffee going cold in his scarred hands, and had said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting he was watching. Now she laid the ham on the plank table, took up the knife, and drew it down through the smoke-dark rind into meat that was rose-deep, and even all the way to the bone, marbled fine, glistening, with no gray ring of spoilage anywhere in it, and no sour catch in the smell, only that clean, sweet mahogany smoke that made a hungry man's mouth ache. Jubal leaned in close, his white stubbled jaw working, his hand short, 2 fingers resting on the table edge. He had cured hog 40 years on this flat grass country, and he had never in his life smelled a ham come out of a Kansas smokehouse smelling like that. "Lord God, girl," he said quietly, "that's not a farm ham. That's a town ham. That's a ham a man pays for." Marin cut a thin sliver and gave it to him on the knife, and gave one to Amos, who took it without meeting her eyes, and she watched both men's faces change in the same way, the slow dawning a man's face does when something is better than he let himself expect. She did not smile. She wrote the date on a slip of paper, and the curing time, and a few small numbers only she understood, and she put the slip in the pocket of her apron with the others. "Hang the rest where the air moves," she said. "These keep. That's the whole of it. Anybody can make a ham. The trick is making one that's still good come March, and these will be." And they were. That was the thing the whole county would come to argue over later when the arguing got loud. that the woman could make a cured ham that did not turn, that held its color and its sweetness clear through the worst of a Kansas winter when other men's pork went rancid in the barrel by February, the first barrels moved before Christmas. Jubal hitched the wagon and hauled 4 down to the crossroads where the hollow elm road met the river track. And a homesteader named, well, the name does not matter, he was one of a dozen who had quit buying Tanner pork 2 winters back when it came to table gray and off, tasted a corner of one ham and bought the barrel on the spot, and came back 8 days later for 2 more and brought his brother. By the new year, there was a quiet line of buyers finding their way to the Tanner place, not many, but steady, men who had given up on Amos and were giving him another look on account of his hired woman, and the money that came in was small, but it was money, and it was the first money the farm had taken in months that did not come strained through Harlan Voss's scales. Amos counted it twice the first night, and once more the second, and he did not know what to do with the feeling in his chest, so he went out to the barn and worked until it passed. Nettie Falk, the storekeeper's wife, heard about the hams the way she heard about everything, which was all at once and louder than the truth. She had been the loudest in town with her tongue, a hired woman, not a wife. She had said, in the store with 3 customers listening, a woman bought to salt pork and warm a widower's house and put on no better than she ought to expect, and Amos Tanner a fool to have spent good money on her. Now a woman she knew came into the store with a Tanner ham wrapped in cloth and unwrapped it on the counter to show, and Nettie, sharp-faced and plump in her starched calico, leaned over it with her arms crossed and her mouth already set to find the fault in it. She found none. She pressed it with her thumb and smelled it, and even, when no one was looking close, pinched off the smallest shred and tasted it, and her face did a thing it did not often do, which was go quiet and thoughtful and a little put out at being made to think better of someone. "Well," she said finally, to no one, rewrapping the ham with more care than she meant to show. "Well, the woman can cure a hog, I'll say that and no more." It was not respect, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall the town had built, and a crack is how the wall comes down. The cold came hard in January, the kind of cold that stands on the flat country with nothing to break it, that comes off the river in the dark and finds every gap in a wall. And it was in the worst of that cold that the thing happened between Amos and Marin that neither of them would have called by name. The best sow on the place, and there were not many left. The herd thinned down to a fraction of what the Tanner pens had once held. Every empty pen a number on Elias Dern's note come spring went down sick in the night, heavy and farrow and fevered, lying in the straw with her sides heaving and not getting up. A sow like that lost was not just a sow. It was the litter she carried, and the litters after. It was breeding stock the farm could not spare and could not replace. And Amos knew it the second Jubal's lantern showed him her staring eye. He sent the old man in out of the cold. Jubal's hands could not take a night like that any more. 2 fingers gone, and the rest stiff as oak. And he set himself to staying up with her, and somewhere past midnight, without being asked, Moraine came out across the black yard in her shawl with a kettle of warm mash and a second blanket, and the dog Soot behind her, and she knelt down in the straw on the far side of the sow, and did not ask his leave, and did not go back in. They worked over the animal through the deepest hours of the night, with the wind hunting at the cracks in the barn wall, and the single lantern throwing their two shadows huge and joined against the boards. She knew things he did not expect her to know, how to bring the fever down, how to coax the mash into the sow a little at a time so she would not founder, how to turn her so she did not crush the unborn against the ground. Amos found himself doing what she said before he had decided to, the way a man will when the one giving the orders plainly knows the work, and twice their hands met on the animal's hot flank in the dark, and neither of them pulled away as quick as they ought. Near 3 in the morning, when it seemed the sow would die and there was nothing to do but wait and see, they sat back against the pen rails a little apart with the cold coming up through the straw, and Amos Tanner talked, not much, not easily, the words coming out of him stiff as the boards behind him, but he talked. He talked about the first winter alone, the one after the fever took his first wife, when he had let the smokehouse fire go out and not cared, when the town had brought casseroles and he had not answered the door, when he had decided, the way a man decides a thing without ever putting words to it, that he would not need anybody again, because needing was just a longer way around to losing. "I didn't send for a wife," he said into the dark, looking at the sick animal and not at her. "I want to be straight about that. I sent for a hand. I figured a man could buy the work and skip the rest of it. The rest of it costs too much." Marin was quiet a long moment. Then she said, in that low, even voice that looked at a thing plain before it spoke, "I know. You were honest about it from the start, and I'd not hold honesty against any man. I didn't come west to be grateful to you either, Amos Tanner. I came because I'd lost everything that was mine, and this was the door that was open." She pulled the shawl tighter. "But I'll tell you something for nothing. The work's never just the work. Never has been, not in any smokehouse my father ever ran. You put your hands to a thing every day, and it gets into you whether you mean it to or not." She did not look at him when she said it. He did not answer, but the sow lived. Toward dawn the fever broke, and she heaved herself up onto her trembling legs and put her snout into the mash, and the two of them, exhausted and stiff and cold to the marrow, looked at each other across the steaming animal, and something passed between them that was not said and could not be taken back. Amos stood up too fast and busied his hands with the rail latch so he would not have to hold her eyes. He had noticed her. He had been noticing her for weeks, the careful, chapped hands and the steady, hazel eyes that took the measure of a man before they took the measure of anything, the unbreakable quiet of her, and he had been fighting it the whole time, the way a man fights sleep. And that night in the barn, he lost the fight without admitting he had been in one. He told himself it was only that they had saved the sow together. He told himself a good many things, walking back across the frozen yard in the gray first light with soot pressing warm against his leg, and he believed none of them. It was a fragile thing, that warmth and unspoken, and both of them handled it the next morning by not handling it at all, by speaking of the herd and the hams and the wood that needed splitting the way two people will when the truth between them is too big to set on the breakfast table. But it was there now, lit, and it would not go out, and Marin felt it as surely as she felt the cold easing out of her hands by the stove, and it frightened her more than the cold had, because she had come west with nothing left to lose, and now there was beginning to be something. She turned her mind hard back to the work, the way she always did, and it was the work, the careful, patient, unsleeping habit of her father's trade that carried her the rest of the way to the thing that had been gnawing quietly at the back of her mind since her second week on the place. Because Marin Calloway kept books. Not the loose, half-guessed reckoning Amos had kept in his head, but real columns in a real hand, every barrel weighed before it left the smokehouse and the weight written down, every grade noted, every price Harlan Voss paid set against the page. And the page was wrong. Voss had come twice now in his good wool coat with his silver watch chain swinging and his smooth, assessing smile, had run his florid hand over her hams, the town hams, the ones that kept clear through to March, and had clucked his tongue and graded them common, at a common price, the same short price the Tanner place had taken for years, and he had weighed the barrels on his own scale off the back of his own wagon, and the weight he wrote down was never the weight Maureen had written down in her careful hand the night before. Always less. A few pounds a barrel, not enough for a man counting in his head to ever catch. But Marin did not count in her head. She had it on the page, his number and her number, barrel after barrel, and the gap between them never once fell in the farm's favor, and a thing that only ever runs one direction is not an error. She said nothing. She smiled at Voss the way you smile at a man you mean to take apart, and she walked the barrels to his wagon herself, and she watched his hands on the scale, and that night she sat by the lamp with her father's habit in her fingers, and laid Voss's receipts out one against the other, going back as far as Amos had kept them, the few he had not lost, and the picture that came up out of those pages was not a picture of bad luck or a hard market or a farm that could not turn a profit. It was a picture of a prosperous man in a good coat who had been quietly bleeding this place for years, a few pounds and a false grade at a time, him and the others he must do it to, paying short weight on every hog and every barrel of cured pork that crossed his scale, and calling it the going rate. Marin Calloway sat very still in the lamplight and looked at the numbers, and the numbers looked back at her. And for the first time since she had stepped off the train into the dust of Hollow Elm, she felt the old cold steel come up in her straight and sure. The hams would sell. The farm might be saved by the hams alone, given a season. But the thing on the page was theft, plain theft, dressed in a wool coat, and it had been taking the bread out of Amos Tanner's mouth for years, while he sat broke at his own table, believing it was his own failing. She closed the ledger and sat with her hand flat on the cover a long while, listening to the wind and the slow breathing of the house. And she did not yet know how she would say it, or whether a closed, guarded man one winter from the bank's ledger would believe his hired woman over the prosperous buyer the whole county dealt with. But she knew now what she was looking at, and she knew it would not stay quiet much longer. It was the number that stopped her, not the smell of brine and oak smoke that had soaked so deep into the smokehouse walls she no longer noticed it, not the cold that lived in the floor even now with the fires banked low, but a number written in Harlan Voss's tidy hand on a slip of paper Jubal Reed had carried back from the buying yard that gray afternoon. Marin Calloway stood at the rough plank table where she kept her own accounts, and laid the slip flat with two chapped fingers and read it again. 41 barrels graded common. Common. She had walked every one of those barrels herself, packed them, weighed them on the corn scale with Jubal, calling the marks aloud while she wrote, and not one of them was common. The hams she had cured by her dead father's method, the slow smoke, the brine he had carried in his head and given to her in his last winters as though handing across a lit lamp. Those hams were as fine as any pork that had ever left the state of Kansas, and she knew it the way she knew her own name. And Harlan Voss had graded the lot common and paid her short, and smiled doing it. She had felt the wrongness of it before, a small, cold finger of doubt that had pressed on her since the first sale, but she had let it lie because a hired woman with a carpet-bag and a contract does not go accusing the richest buyer in the county on a feeling. Now she had a slip of paper, and a slip of paper she could measure against her own ledger, and that was a different thing entirely. So that night, after the fires were seen to and the herd was quiet, and Amos Tanner had gone into the silence of his house with the dead first wife's grief still hanging in the corners of it, Marin lit a second candle she could ill afford to burn and went looking. She had her own book, kept small and exact in the back of the carpet-bag, every barrel, every weight, every grade she believed it ought to fetch. But she wanted more than her own word against his. She wanted his own hand to convict him. And so she went, the next gray morning, to the one place a record of years would lie undisturbed, and she asked Amos for the old papers. He was forking down feed when she found him, his breath smoking in the raw air, the brown canvas coat dark at the shoulders with damp, and he looked at her the way he looked at most things now, not unkind, only closed, a man who had shut a door long ago and grown used to the quiet behind it. "What papers?" he said. It was not a question so much as a wall. "The buyer's slips," Marin said. "Every sale Voss ever paid you, you'd have kept them. A man one bad winter from the bank keeps his slips." She did not flinch under the gray of his eyes. She had stopped flinching weeks ago. "I want to look at the old ones against the new." For a long moment Amos said nothing, and she could see him deciding whether this was worth the cost of opening the cupboard where the past was kept. Then he drove the fork into the straw hard and walked past her toward the house, and that was as near to yes as the man came. In the cold front room, in a tin box gone orange with rust at the corners, were years of Harlan Voss's tidy hand. Marin spread them on the table where the first wife's mending basket still sat untouched, and she laid her own ledger beside them, and she began to read backward into the life of the Tanner place. And what she found there she had half known she would find, but the size of it still took her breath. It was not one bad sale. It was every sale, year on year, the same crooked arithmetic running quiet under the floor of the whole farm like rot under a good board. Hogs weighed in at the buying yard at less than they had carried out of this very gate, 6 pounds here, 9 there, 11 on a fat barrow that any honest scale would have called what it was. Cured pork that should have graded prime set down as common, and the price the difference of a man's whole living. She took a fresh sheet, and she did the sums the way her father had taught her, slow and twice, and when she had the figure, she sat very still and looked at it. Years of short weight and false grade, a little skimmed off every load, so that no single theft was big enough to fight over, and all of it together, more than enough. She saw it now with a terrible, clean clarity, more than enough to have kept this farm clear of Elias Dern's note from the start. Amos Tanner was not one bad winter from the bank because hogs were cheap or the land was poor or because God had turned his face. He was one bad winter from the bank because Harlan Voss had been quietly carrying off the difference for years into a good wool coat and a silver watch chain, and calling it the price of doing business. She did not run to Amos with it. That was the thing in her, the patience that the town had mistaken for meekness, and Nettie Falk had sneered at as the manner of a hired woman who knew her place. Marion Calloway knew, better than any of them, that a true thing carried wrong becomes a lie in the hearing. So she went back out to the smokehouse, and she did what her father would have done. She got proof. She had Jubal Reed help her reweigh the 4 barrels still standing unsold against the wall, the good scale checked first with a sack of shot of a known weight, so no man could say her scale was the crooked one. She wrote the marks. She matched them against the slips Voss had paid for their like, and she built it, piece by piece, across 2 days, the way you build a fire that will not go out, the old receipts, the reweighed barrels, her own clean ledger, the corn scale honest under all of it, until she had not a feeling and not an accusation, but a thing a banker could read, a thing that would stand in a room full of men who did business with Harlan Voss and did not want to believe her. Old Jubal, white-stubbled and stooped and missing his 2 fingers, watched her lay the last column straight, and he wagged his head slow. "Knowed something weren't right," he said in his slow way. "Year after year, never could find where the hole was." He looked at the pages and then at her with something close to wonder. "You found the hole." "He cut it," Marion said quietly, "a little at a time, so nobody'd fight him over it. That's the trick of it, Jubal. Steal small and steal steady, and a man'll blame the weather his whole life." She tapped the column where she had set Voss's grade beside her own, prime against common, the 2 words, a chasm with a year's living fallen into it. "A man who steals a wagon gets hung. A man who steals a few pounds off 1,000 wagons buys a watch chain and gets called shrewd. But it's the same man, Jubal, and it's the same theft, only spread thin enough that nobody can hold a fistful of it at once." The old hand nodded slow over his missing fingers, and she gathered her sheets and weighted them under the shot sack, so the draft from the smokehouse door would not scatter a single one. Soot, the ribby black and tan, lay against her boot in the cold and thumped his tail once, and she rested her hand a moment on his bony skull, and then she gathered the pages, because the part she dreaded was not Voss at all. It was the man in the house, because here was the danger, and she had turned it over all the while her hands were busy with the scale. She was a hired woman, a stranger off a train with a carpetbag and a contract, 8 months in Hollow Elm, and she was about to stand in front of Amos Tanner and tell him that the prosperous, smiling buyer the whole county trusted, the man Amos's own father had likely sold to, the man every neighbor down the Smoky Hill still dealt with, was a thief who had bled this place for years, and ask him to take her word for it, her word against a silver watch chain. She knew what most men would do with that. Most men would rather keep the comfortable lie that the weather had ruined them than swallow the harder truth that they had let themselves be robbed in plain daylight by a man they shook hands with. Pride was a thing she had learned to fear more than poverty, and Amos Tanner had a great deal of pride and very little reason, after the life he had lived, to trust the judgment of a woman he had ordered the way he ordered seed corn. She brought it to him that evening at the kitchen table, the lamp turned up, the pages squared in front of her, and she did not soften it, and she did not dress it. She laid the slips down one at a time, and she walked him through the numbers in her plain, even voice, the way her father had walked her through them. No heat in it, only the arithmetic standing there for any man to see. Amos sat with his scarred hands flat on the table and his weather-brown face giving back nothing. And when she finished, he was quiet so long that the fire ticked twice in the stove before he spoke. "You're telling me Harlan Voss is a thief," he said. "Low, careful." A man laying his hand on a thing to see how hot it was. "I'm telling you what the scale says," Marin answered, "and what his own slips say against it. I'm not asking you to believe me, Amos. I'm asking you to believe the numbers. They're not mine. Half of them are his." "Harlan Voss bought off my father," Amos said, and there it was, the pride and the old loyalty and the awful weight of being wrong for years, all moving under the words. 20 years that man's been weighing hogs in this county, and you've been here since spring." He was not shouting. He never shouted. But she heard the edge of it, the part of him that wanted, badly, for this to be a stranger's mistake and not his own life laid bare. "You know how this sounds. A hired woman comes off a train, and inside a year she's got the whole county figured better than the men who farmed it their lives." "I know exactly how it sounds." She did not look away from him. "It sounds like a woman reaching above herself. I've heard Nettie Falk say worse to my face, and I'll hear it again. But I didn't come here to be liked, Amos. I came here because I had nowhere left to be, and I'll tell you something straight, the way I've tried to be straight with you since the day I stepped down off that train. I'd rather you hate me and keep your farm than thank me and lose it, so you can call me a liar. But weigh the barrels yourself before you do. Take the shot sack and check my scale and weigh them with your own hands, and then call me a liar, and I'll pack my bag in the morning and go." She pushed the slip across the boards toward him, the one that had started it. 41 barrels grated common. "That's not common pork. You've eaten it. You know it isn't." And that small true thing, the pork he had tasted at his own table, was what broke through where the numbers could not. Amos Tanner picked up the slip and held it in the lamplight, and she watched the years rearrange themselves behind his gray eyes, watched him stop blaming the weather. He set the paper down very gently, as a man sets down something he has just understood is dangerous. "He grades them common," Amos said slowly, "because nobody out here can tell the difference. Nobody but you." He looked up at her, and for the first time it was not a closed door she saw, but a man on the other side of it. "And he never figured anybody'd hand me a wife who could read a ledger." "He never figured on a wife at all," Marin said. "He figured you for a man too tired to count. Grief makes a careless bookkeeper, Amos, and he knew it, and he'd been trading on it since you buried her." She said it plainly, without cruelty, the way she said all the hardest things, and she watched him take it without flinching. The first wife named at last in that kitchen, out loud, in the place where her mending still waited, and the roof did not fall. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind came off the flat grass country and worked at the eaves, and somewhere the thinning herd stirred and settled. Amos Tanner sat with his thief's slips in front of him, and his dead wife's mending basket in the corner, and his whole ruined arithmetic turned suddenly into something he could fight. And Marin let the silence stand, because she had learned that a man arrives at a thing surer when he is not pushed the last step. "Dern wants the full balance by spring," Amos said at last, and it was not a complaint now, but a clearing of the ground. "I always thought there was no way to it. You don't make that kind of money curing hogs in Hollow Elm." "You do," Marin said, "if you stop letting half of it walk off in Harlan Voss's coat. And you do if the man you sell to is paying you what the pork is worth instead of what he can get away with." She gathered the pages and squared them again. "I can sell these hams, Amos. There's buyers in Abilene and beyond who'd pay prime and be glad of it. I know that trade. I was raised in it. But not while Voss has the grade of every barrel in this county in his pocket, and not while every neighbor down the river still trusts him. We don't just stop selling to him. He'd only do it to the next man, and he'd put it out that I'm a fraud and you a fool, and we'd never sell a barrel here again." She met his eyes. "We have to show him, in the open, in front of the men he buys from, so it's his word that breaks and not ours." It was the word "we" that she heard herself say, and she saw that he heard it too, and neither of them remarked on it, because some things are surer for not being named. Amos turned the slip over once more in his big scarred fingers, and then he laid his hand flat upon the whole stack, the slips and the ledger and the honest sums, as a man lays his hand on a Bible or a deal. "All right," he said. "We weigh it again in the morning, every barrel, and I'll do the weighing myself, so no man living can say it was rigged. And if it comes out the way you say it will—" He stopped, and something moved in the weathered face that was not quite a smile, but was the country it grew in. "Then we go and we put it to Harlan Voss in front of the whole buying yard, you and me, and we let his own scale call him what he is." "You and me," Marin said. "You and me," said Amos Tanner. And for the first time since Fever took his first wife, he said it like a man who meant to keep a thing rather than lose it. He did not answer her right away, and the silence in that kitchen stretched long enough that she thought he meant to let it stand unanswered, the way he had let so much else stand between them since October. The lamp guttered low. Outside, the wind had laid down for the night, and the cold had come on hard and still, and she could hear Soot shift his weight against the doorstone, and Jubal Reed's slow cough somewhere out in the dark of the yard. Amos Tanner sat with his big scarred hands flat on the table on either side of the ledger she had set there, the one with the columns she had been keeping in her small upright hand all winter, and the older one beneath it in his dead first wife's faded pencil, and the third thing, the bundle of Harlan Voss's receipts she had pulled out of the barrel house and the back of the smokehouse and the bottom of a flour tin, going back 4 years and more. She had laid it all out plain. She had not raised her voice. She had told him only what the numbers said, and what the numbers said was that the man the whole county trusted, the man in the good wool coat with the silver watch chain who shook hands and called every farmer by his first name, had been bleeding the Tanner place a little at a time for longer than she had been alive to it. Short weight on every barrel. A common grade stamped on hams that any honest buyer in 3 counties would have paid premium for. A penny here and a nickel there, set down so reasonable and so smooth that no one tired and broke and grieving had ever stopped to add them up. And now she had added them up, and she had said the hardest part last, looking at him steady with those dark hazel eyes that always looked at the person before they looked at anything else. She had said she knew what she was asking. She was a hired woman. Voss was a man he had dealt with for 10 years, and if Amos chose to believe the buyer over the bride, she would understand it, and she would keep curing his pork all the same, because that was the work she had contracted to do. That was when he finally moved. He turned the bundle of receipts over with one finger, slow, and he looked at the figures a long time, and when he spoke his voice came out rough and low, like a thing dragged up from a deep place. "I'm a fool," he said. "I'm a worse fool than they take me for." And then, because he was a plain-spoken man who had shut the door on needing anyone, he said the next thing badly, looking not at her, but at his own hands. He said he had married her to salt the pork. He said it the way a man confesses a meanness. He said he had ordered her the same as a load of seed corn, and he had treated her no better than that all the cold months she had stood in his smokehouse making something out of his ruin, and he was ashamed of it, and he did not have the words to undo it. Then he made himself look up. "I'd like to be straight with you about that," he said, which were her own words, the ones she had given him weeks ago, and she understood that he had carried them and turned them and meant to give them back. "I didn't want a wife. I wanted to not lose the place. And somewhere in here I stopped being able to tell the difference between you and the place. And I don't want to anymore. I want a real marriage, Maureen, not the paper kind, if you'll have a fool who took half a winter to see what was standing in his own kitchen." She did not weep, because she was not a woman who wept easily, and she did not throw herself at him, because she had not come west to be grateful to anyone. She let the words sit a moment in the lamplight so he would know she had weighed them like everything else. Then she said yes. She said it the way she said most true things, quiet and unbreakable, and she put her chapped, work-hardened hand over his big, scarred one on the ledger, and that was the whole of it. There were no speeches. There was just the wind down and the lamp low, and two people who had each lost everything once agreeing, plainly, to risk it again. The contract did not so much end that night as turn into something the law had no proper name for, though the law's name for it was the only one the town would use. In the morning they did not announce it. They went out together into the gray cold, and the first thing they did, husband and wife now in the only way that mattered, was load the wagon with the proof. Because saying yes to each other in a warm kitchen was one thing, and bringing down Harlan Voss in front of the whole of Hollow Elm was another, and Marin Calloway had never in her life been content to be right where no one could see it. They drove into town on a hard, bright Saturday when the buyers and the drovers and the farmers were all gathered at the long scale by the railhead, and Voss was there in his good coat, florid and prosperous, weighing another man's barrels, with that smooth, assessing smile and that small, flat eye that gave nothing away. Amos did not shout. That was the thing Marin had counseled the night before, mapping it out by the fire the way she mapped a brine. A loud man is easy to call a liar, and a quiet man with a column of figures is not. So Amos set their own barrels on Voss's scale, and then he set them on the second scale, the railroad's certified scale that the man himself never used if he could help it, and the number was different by 11 pounds, and 11 pounds was a thing a crowd could see. Then Maureen spoke. She had not meant to. She had meant to let the figures do it, but Voss made the mistake of laughing, a small, reasonable laugh, and saying that a hired woman doing sums at a kitchen table was hardly a thing to set against the word of an honest broker who had fed this county for a decade. So she stepped up onto the scale platform in her plain gray-blue dress gone thin at the cuffs, her chestnut hair pinned plain under the faded blue bonnet, and she laid out the bundle of his own receipts where every man there could read his own name on them, and she read the grades back to him. She read what he had stamped on the Tanner hams and what those same hams had sold for, 2 counties east, under an honest buyer's mark, after she had quietly shipped a trial barrel out on the railroad in November under her own name to see what the open market would say. The market had said nearly double. She read that number out, and then she read the 4 years of difference totaled in dollars, and the figure landed in that cold, bright air and sat there, and nobody laughed. It was not only the Tanner place. That was the thing that finished him. Other men in that crowd had been weighing barrels on Voss's scale for years, and now they were doing the arithmetic too, each on his own ruin, and the smooth assessing smile came off Harlan Voss's face by degrees, as he understood that the woman on the platform had not just defended one homestead, she had handed every farmer in 3 counties the means to add up what he had taken from them. He tried the reasonable voice. He said the scales drifted in cold weather, that any honest man's number wandered a pound or 2, that a single trial barrel sold east proved nothing about the run of common pork a busy broker handled in volume. But the receipts were in his own hand, and the certified scale did not drift 11 pounds, and the trial barrel had not sold east as common pork. It had sold as the best a buyer had seen all season, and every man there could read. The reasonable voice had no purchase any more. It only made the smallness of the thing plainer, a prosperous man explaining, patient and smiling, why the figures he had set down himself did not mean what they plainly said. By the end of that morning, the drovers would not deal with him, and by the end of that week, the honest buyers were writing to the Tanner place direct. And within the month, Harlan Voss had loaded his good wool coat and his silver watch chain onto an eastbound train and was gone from Hollow Elm, and no one was sorry, and the conflict had never once come to blows, which was its own kind of justice, the kind that is paid in ledgers and never given back in coin alone, but in the slow ruin of a man's good name. Elias Dern came out to the Tanner place himself before the spring deadline, lean and precise in his black frock coat, his spectacles catching the late light, the gray side whiskers exact. He had set the note with the full balance due by spring, because that was the cold arithmetic of the ledger made human, and now the same arithmetic ran the other way. The honest grades on a winter's worth of superior cured pork. The barrels rerouted from buyers in 3 counties who had heard there was a smokehouse west of the Smoky Hill curing hams that kept through any thaw and tasted of something a man could not name and would pay for twice. It cleared the note. It cleared it and left a margin. And Dern, who was not a villain and never had been, only the figures, sat at their kitchen table and entered the payment in his own book, and then did a thing Marin had not expected. He asked her, plainly, businesslike, whether she would consider taking the curing of other men's hogs on contract for a fee, because half the county wanted what came out of that building now, and she could not raise enough hogs alone to meet it. He was offering her a trade. She said she would think on it, which meant she already had, 3 weeks before, and had the figures for it folded in the back of the ledger. The town came around the way towns do, slow and grudging, and then all at once. Nettie Falk, the storekeeper's wife, who had stood in her starched calico and her apron and called Maureen a hired woman and not a wife to anyone who would stand still for it, was the last and loudest to turn, and so the turning meant the most. It came in the small, concrete way such things come. One day, Nettie was simply telling a customer at the counter that, of course, the Tanner hams were the finest in the territory. Everyone knew it, as though she had said it all along, as though she had not once made the word hired sound like a thing scraped off a boot. And another day, she sent her own daughter out to the Tanner place to ask, almost civil, whether Mrs. Tanner might be persuaded to cure the family's autumn hog. And Marin said yes, and charged her full price, and Nettie paid it. And that was the closest thing to an apology that woman had in her. And Marin took it as one because she was not a person who needed to be thanked, only paid honest. The love, when it showed the way Amos showed everything, in work and not in words. He built her a second smokehouse before the next winter, with his own scarred hands and Jubal Reed beside him, the old man stooped and white-stubbled and missing his 2 fingers, and slow-spoken and prouder of that building than of anything he had raised in 40 years, because he had believed in her from the first when belief cost something. Amos built it bigger than the first and tighter, and he put a window in it low on the east wall, because he had noticed, and a man who notices a thing like that has stopped being able to tell where he ends and the other person begins, that she liked to work in the morning light. He never said why he put the window in. She never asked. She knew. There were other things, all of them small and all of them plain. He learned the way she took her coffee and had it waiting black and scalding on the cold morning she went out to mind a long cure. When her hands cracked open at the knuckles from the brine and the winter, he came in one evening without a word and set a tin of salve on the table by her ledger, the kind the storekeeper kept behind the counter, and went back out to the barn before she could say anything about it, and that was Amos Tanner saying he loved her as near as he could say it. She, who had not come west to be grateful to anyone, found she was not grateful so much as at home, which is a different and a steadier thing. She started keeping a place set for him at the head of the table again, the place that had stood empty since the fever, and the first night she did it, he stopped in the doorway and looked at it a long moment, and then sat down and ate and said nothing, and the grief that had lived in that house since his first wife went began very slowly to become only a memory a man could carry without it carrying him. And Soot, the ribby black and tan dog who had attached himself to her in October and never once reconsidered it, took to sleeping across the threshold of the new building, as though he too understood that this was the heart of the place now, the thing the whole farm turned on. So the Tanner place did not become a legend, and it did not become a fortune in the way of stories where money falls from a hidden floor. It became something plainer and harder won. It became the richest, most sought-after smokehouse in the territory, with buyers rerouting their wagons from 3 counties to come up the flat grass road and stand at the door. And it stayed that way not because of any secret, but because of the oldest thing there is, which is a thing done right by a person who refuses to do it any other way. The smokehouse stayed warm. Through the long Kansas winters, the fire banked low, and the smoke curled blue and steady in the dark, and the hams hung curing in the rows, dark and patient, taking the salt and the smoke and the slow turning of the cold months the way they had since her father kept his own smokehouse back east, before the family and the people and the business were all lost, before she came west out of options and walked into a stranger's failing yard and decided, with that first flicker of quiet steel, that she had put herself exactly where she meant to be. Amos Tanner still rises before the light and walks out across the frost with the heavy patience of a man used to carrying things. Only now he is not carrying them alone, and the gray in his eyes has learned late and slow to hope again. Marin keeps the ledgers in her small upright hand, and the columns add up true. There is no grand ending to it, no death by some far-off year, no last word that ties a bow on a life. There is only the working place at rest, the fire banked, the hams in the dark, the dog on the threshold. Two people who built something out of nothing standing in a doorway at dusk, not saying much, because they never did. The ordinary was the whole of it. It always had been. That was the wealth. And they knew it. And they let the warm smoke rise into the cold and asked for nothing more.